Hello guys, and welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we're doing more of a history lesson in a sense, where we're going to be looking through the past 50 or last 50 years-ish, 60 years of presidential elections running back from since 1960 up to our last election, presidential election in 2016. But just a quick review again. Sorry for the lack of uploads in the past week. I've been pretty busy, but to reward you guys for sticking through, I'll start sort of a daily upload schedule. So expect at least one, maybe two videos, maybe even 3 videos in one day. But sticking to today's video, we're gonna be doing a rundown of all the elections since 1960 and seeing how the demographics of the country of the United States have changed. But again, we're going to be only doing a brief rundown, because if I would go in depth, this would be about a 30-minute video. But again, just to save some time, we're just going to be doing a brief review. And so starting off with our first election in 1960, as we know, he was Senator Democrat from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, facing off against current Vice President Richard Nixon, as we know, who did go on to actually become president later on. But as you take a look on your map, John F. Kennedy did win this election actually by carrying the states of by carrying a lot of the southern states, despite him being for civil rights, which is why you see a lighter shade of blue in Mississippi and in Alabama, because unpledged electors, due to their anger of him being for the civil rights movement, decided to cast their votes for Harry Byrd, a senator from Virginia. But if you do take a look, actually, the western coast, with Washington, Oregon, and California, were actually safe Republican states back then, with the exception of Washington. But if you do take a look, the Democrat did extraordinarily well in the South, and in New England, with the exception of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, which at the time were safe Republican states. And if you do take a look, the heartland of the country was pretty evenly divided, with Ohio. The last time Ohio did not choose the winner was in 1960 in this election, where they voted for Richard Nixon, and Wisconsin and Iowa as well did vote for Richard Nixon. But states that did help him were big states like Pennsylvania had 32 electoral votes, Michigan that had 20, and Minnesota that had 11, and Illinois actually, which somewhat decided this election, that had 27. And so, as we do know, he did win this election. And going on with the next election, 1964. This was Lyndon B. Johnson, who was John F. Kennedy's vice president. Because again, he was assassinated, he assumed the presidency. And as we do take a look, this was a shellacking, a blowout, almost 500 electoral votes for Lyndon B. Johnson. Barry Goldwater only carried his home state of Arizona and the South and the Deep South. Mainly because he was against the civil rights movement. Again, Arizona was also his home state, and Lyndon B. Johnson and his campaign managed to make Barry Goldwater to be perceived as a lunatic who didn't know what he was doing. Again, as many of you guys have seen that famous or infamous ad, the Daisy commercial, where it shows that the girl counting down to the nuclear time bomb. So, as you take a look, every state except the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and his home state of Arizona, went for Barry Goldwater, and the rest of the states went for Lyndon B. Johnson. Again, this was a big blowout. And so, in 1968, we actually have 3 candidates running for the presidency. George Wallace, who ran as an American independent, and as you do take a look, he was against the civil rights movement and for segregation. Again, he did win only in the Deep South, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and one elector that decided to cast a vote for him. But if you do take a look, it was Richard Nixon, who was the former vice president, again, as we knew, who did lose in 1960, the current vice president, Hubert Humphrey from the state of Minnesota, and George Wallace. But as I think you probably know, Richard Nixon did end up winning this election due to the switch of Democratic votes going to George Wallace, because again, as you take a look, it was by state, it was essentially a shellacking for or in favor of Richard Nixon again. Maine did go blue, which was a change, but Vermont, New Hampshire stayed Republican, New Jersey, Delaware, and everywhere else except in reliably Democratic states, with the exception of Texas, went red. Again, from Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, all the way in the Great Plains, the Sun Belt, California, his home state. Well, technically New York was his home state at the time, but essentially, he went everywhere except where heavily Democratic areas were. Texas is the only exception where was a toss-up state, and he did. Hubert Humphrey did do pretty well in Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. Again, New Hampshire was a state Democratic state. But two things that I like to actually say specifically about this election was George Wallace's attempt, or plan was to put this election to a deadlock where no person reached 270 electoral votes, and he could win the House of Representatives. And if you actually do search up right now, the election by electoral vote wasn't close. It was about 100 electoral vote margin, but by popular vote, it was less than 1 million votes that separated Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. But nevertheless, Richard Nixon does win, and in 1972. We do take a look. Richard Nixon again. Well, in this case, George McGovern, who was the candidate for the Democrats, perceived as a socialist, got shellacked. He couldn't even win his home state of South Dakota. Again, we know the infamous Watergate scandal. But in this election, Richard Nixon carried all 49 states with the exception of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, which has never voted Republican. But if you do take a look, again, because of the Watergate scandal, in a sense, gave away the Democratic Party's tactics, and Richard Nixon also made George McGovern to be perceived as a socialist maniac who didn't know what he was doing. And so, as you take a look, every state went for Richard Nixon. From Maine to California, from in the center of the state, in the heartland of the country, everywhere, all 49 states went to Richard Nixon, which I believe got him to 521 electoral votes, if I'm not mistaken. But again, this election was essentially shellacking, but we do know what happens in the next election. Again, we do know that Richard Nixon does actually resign in the next election. In his next term due to the Watergate scandal, and that sets up the plate for or the path for victory for Jimmy Carter, who was a former governor from Georgia at the time. And if you do take a look, since him being from the South, he actually did manage to get the Southern roots from the South back to the Democrats, because this was a time where uncertainty with the government was a thing, because a lot of the American people couldn't trust their government. And if you actually take a look by margin of victory, a lot of these states weren't actually decided by a big margin. A lot of these states were decided by small margins. But if you take a look, Gerald Ford, who was the appointed vice president, turned president successor due to Richard Nixon's resignation, did very well in the Great Plains and in the Republican West Coast. Sort of weird saying that today, but and Jimmy Carter did really well in the South, in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Minnesota and Wisconsin, where his vice president Walter Mondale was from. And again, Jimmy Carter did actually very well due to him running on a truthful campaign, which many of the American people wanted. They didn't really care about the policies or the issues back then, or not back then, excuse me. But in this specific election, because they couldn't, they didn't have confidence in their government. So, but we do know what happens in the next election. A big shift in many states. Again, in 1980, another Republican landslide. This time for former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who we know was an incredible figure in politics, still is. Basically brought up Republican conservatism to what it is today, and Democratic incumbent president Jimmy Carter lost in the biggest landslide ever for an incumbent president. Again, because of the energy crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, Ronald Reagan won every state except Vice President Walter Mondale's home state of Minnesota, his home state of Georgia, West Virginia, which was a solid Democratic state, Maryland, D.C., and Rhode Island. Besides that, he carried every state from the West Coast to the Great Plains to the heartland of the country to New England, California, New York, big states of course. He carried all these states by a pretty good margin and defeated, despite the election not actually being, or expected to be pretty close, in the weeks that were going up there. It ended up actually not being very close. And just to pick up the pace of it, again, 1984 wasn't really a big difference. The only state that did vote, it was a rematch. Ronald Reagan against Walter Mondale, who was a former vice president. Only won his home state of Minnesota by about 20,000 votes, and the District of Columbia, with Ronald Reagan winning 525 electoral votes, every state in the Union, and not really much to talk about, just a blowout. In 1988, we actually have Ronald Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, who did win in another landslide, 111 for Democratic governor from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, who we know about that question about rape and murder, which we know cost him essentially the election. Yeah, George W. Bush did very well in keeping the Reagan base and doing pretty well in the heartland of the country. Did very well in the Great Plains, in the West Coast, in the South. As we do know, we see that one faithless elector for Lloyd Benson, who essentially the ticket flipped. But this was the last election where Pennsylvania and Wisconsin voted for a Republican until 2016. Again, not really much to talk about here, another Democratic landslide. On the other hand, in 1992, we have Bill Clinton, who was the governor of Arkansas, changing this map entirely. The first time a Democrat was elected since Jimmy Carter. In 1992, he flipped a lot is a very, essentially a very small word in this case. He flipped about 20 states back to the Democrats. He brought back a portion of the Great South. He flipped the entire West Coast, got Montana, and did incredibly well in the heartland of the country. Did very well in California, the West Coast, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, home state of Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Al Gore's his vice presidential choice, home state, Missouri, and in New England, again, against an incumbent president in George H.W. Bush. And so, not really much to talk about. On to the next election. Another landslide. The first time a Democrat was reelected since Theodore Roosevelt, actually, I believe. In 1996, Bill Clinton did win re-election, only losing the states of Colorado, Georgia, and Montana, but winning the state of Florida and Arizona. Again, he did very well in keeping his base in the South here, winning Florida and in the West Coast, the heartland of the country, and New England against Bob Dole, who's the current majority leader in the Senate. And so Bill Clinton wins re-election, and nothing much to talk about. But there is a lot to talk about in this election, the 2000 election, like that. I'm sure all of you know the Florida, of course, decided this election, 271 to 266 electors or electoral votes for George W. Bush to be elected the 43rd president. Despite Bill Clinton being unpopular in his second term due to the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Al Gore ran and actually did pretty well. But an issue he actually had was again, his debate performances, his clean coal things that he would say, which definitely flipped West Virginia. And if you do take a look in comparison to 1996, you actually see Arizona, New Mexico, not New Mexico, but you see a lot of states flip. Arizona, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, his home state. He couldn't even carry his home state. Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana, as well as Arizona and Nevada. And a big issue was because of political partisanship. Democrats did very well in the West Coast, here in the Rust Belt, and in New England. New Hampshire and Iowa were toss-up states, while Republicans did very well in the South and in the Great Plains. And again, this election was famous for the Florida recount, and George W. Bush was actually reelected via the Supreme Court. And now going into 2004, not really much of a change. Only the states of Iowa and New Mexico flipped to George W. Bush, him winning this election against Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, 281 to 250. I can't remember the exact number, but 254, I want to say, somewhere around there. But 256, excuse me, yeah, that's what it was. Because one faithless elector casted a vote for John Edwards, his vice presidential nominee in Minnesota. But again, not really much of a change. More political partisanship in this election. But as we do know, the re-election of George W. Bush led to the election of our first African-American president, Barack Obama, who was the outgoing president in 2017. Again, he flipped many states due to the recession. This election was actually pretty close. Before the recession and before the economic depression, the Great Depression came. The first time Nebraska's electoral votes were split in Nevada, Barack Obama brought huge increase into youth voters, African American voters, and Latino voters, which helped him carry the West Coast, western states like Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. The Rust Belt, oh god, excuse me, I've been talking a lot. The Eastern Atlantic Seaboard and New England. Again, he won 265 to 173, and he, as we know, in 2012 also won re-election, with only the exception of losing the state of Indiana and North Carolina. Again, not really much of a change. Most of these states held, despite Florida, which is expected to go to Mitt Romney, actually went to Barack Obama. But again, somewhat close polling actually turned into a not close electoral college victory, or not a pretty big close electoral college victory for Barack Obama, and he's reelected the 44th president in the United States. And this is the election you all probably remember. The 2016 election with Donald Trump, businessman from New York, winning re-election. Many states, again, he defied the polls, he defied basically every big poll station, flipping the Rust Belt for the first time, winning Wisconsin for the first time since 1972, winning Ohio for the first time since 2004, winning Michigan and Pennsylvania for the first time since the George W. Bush landslide in 1988, as well as Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. So many states he flipped, and this was really a shocker for the Democrats. As we still know, Donald Trump isn't doing the best in his presidency, but this election was certainly an eye-opener, an earthquake essentially for everyone. Again, Donald Trump did win 304 to 227 with some faithless electors, many faithless electors actually, casting votes for somebody else, 7 electors I believe in total. But this is the end of the video. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did actually stay to the end, and if you would want any more information on certain elections, I'll be happy to tell you in the comment section below. Just comment down any questions, any suggestions for new videos. And yeah, I hope you did enjoy this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.